Mayor G.T. Bynum of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us in this virtual space. It is a critical time, as you know, the pandemic calling for real leadership, moral clarity, as well as innovation. Tulsa is one of the few cities in the country that got ahead of the spread of the coronavirus. You behaved in a way gaming out the worst case scenario. The president didn't call for it. The governor didn't call for it. The CDC didn't even call for it. Why did you take that approach?
We are a city that is accustomed to dealing with natural disasters. We're in Tornado Alley, where the most tornadoes anywhere in the world occur. We're just a year removed from having a 100-year flood here in our city. And having gone through that as a mayor, I learned a lot that I've been able to apply to this event. I think probably one of the most important things that I learned from that experience, though, was that you have two options when you have a disaster as it relates to public communications. There's one option of, if we tell everyone this, they might panic, and we need to hold this information close and just make decisions and tell people what they need to hear, but nothing more. And what I've found is that tends to panic people more if they feel like information is being held back from them. The other option is just radical transparency. And what we learned during our flood last year, where we were being hit by tornadoes and floods at the same time, was that sharing information, telling people here's what the worst case scenario could look like, it allows them to then prepare on their own and gives them the information they need. I'm very fortunate to be a mayor in an era when there's a great network of mayors all around the country, and I have mayors who are friends on the coasts. In particular, Mayor of Seattle, who I just went through a fellowship program with over the last 2 years. And I was able to see, it hit Seattle about 2 weeks before it hit here. And so I was able to learn from what she experienced there, what she went through.
At the same time, you were calling for restrictions for 250 people or less, right? That you had that in place. But the governor, your Republican governor, Stitz at the time, was tweeting photos out of himself and his family eating out for dinner and encouraging others to do the same. How did you manage that? How did you handle that?
It was tough because they're hearing mixed things from their leaders. But I think that instance, that day, was really a microcosm of the overall tug of war and values in this entire pandemic event, which is how far you can go relative to public health, but also a desire not to run your economy into the ground at the same time. And so I think the governor, to be fair to him, he had a very legitimate concern, which I share, and I think every elected official around the country shares, which is, how far can we go without damaging our economy and running it into the ground?
Did it surprise you that the governor actually followed your lead after that? Because 2 days later, you called for even more severe restrictions, and the governor actually ended up following what you were doing locally on the ground.
It was a really interesting instance because the Tulsa metro area and the Oklahoma City metro area, we really worked in concert between the two of us. We recognize the greatest density in our state is in those two metro areas. And so the mayor of Oklahoma City and we visited throughout every day for the early weeks of this event to make sure that our two communities had the same regulations in place, and then our suburbs joined us in that. And so by the time the state took action, you really already had the majority of Oklahomans who lived in those metro areas taking those actions and putting those precautions in place.
You wrote an op-ed where you said you're a red state mayor, a Republican. You were telling your residents they had to stay home, and you were surprised by the reaction. Some said, of course, shut in, but others were comparing you to Hitler. Why do you suppose that was the reaction from your community?
Well, I think no one likes to be told not to do things. And I think this is the trade-off that we face in our community from having not been hit as hard as the coastal United States was, is that it's harder for people here to appreciate how severe the virus is because we took those early steps and slowed its spread and maintained our healthcare system's integrity. And so when you continue to tell people the things they can't do, you have a lot of folks here, myself included, who love personal freedom, and it's hard when the government is telling you what you can and can't do.
You also write in your op-ed, you do give President Trump credit and the administration for some of the things that they have done in reaction, response to the virus, to the pandemic. Do you believe that the administration, the president, has been portrayed and treated in a way that is fairly regarding his response to this?
The reality is that his travel ban that he put in place, that was very important for us. There was our early cases that we had in Tulsa were people who were coming back from foreign countries where coronavirus was already very hot and bringing it into Tulsa. And there was a sense in our community of powerlessness that we could not stop people from bringing it back to the United States and specifically to our community. And the president's ban was a great relief for us in that regard. And so I don't think that the president's actions have been treated fairly. I mean, this is a president who's having to deal with something that's unprecedented for our country. And so I think the president and I can empathize with it, he has had to struggle with that balance between trying to keep an economy afloat while also trying to do what's right on the public health side. And that's a tension for any elected official, whether it's the president of the United States or the mayor of a mid-sized city.
Talk about your message, the TED Talk, because you put it out there. You described your race, and in terms where you said, "Hey, you don't want it to be a partisan food fight; that you would rather focus on policy." And you described the race with the Republican, your opponent, who described you in ways that your children said you were like Voldemort or Orville Redenbacher. What was the point of the TED Talk there?
First, I mean, it bears mentioning that I too am a Republican, but I think the purpose of my talk, which has really been, I think, one of the focal points of my time in office, is that I've wanted to show that we can work together across party lines and focus on the greatest challenges that we have before us. And so in Tulsa, I don't care if someone is a Republican or a Democrat. If they're passionate about improving our community and want to play a part, I want them on board and I want their help. And we're focusing on major issues. I'm a big believer that you make better decisions when you have a diversity of life experience and opinions being shared and brought to bear on an issue. And that's what we've tried to create here in Tulsa.
And you have emphasized data and innovation for your city. You've attracted Google and Amazon. Do we see Tesla coming your way?
We are going to give every shot we can at bringing Tesla to Tulsa. And that's one of those things, when I was running for mayor, I really wanted us to be focused on being a globally competitive city and setting aside stupid little fights that would have had historically happen, whether that was between Republicans and Democrats or the city and the suburbs or whatever it usually is that causes cities to spend all their time on small ball and not focusing on global competition. And by doing that, by ignoring those petty differences and working together, we've brought the two largest new employers in history to our city. And we are very much in a competitive position to bring Tesla to Tulsa.
What is the one thing that you've learned about yourself from this pandemic? What has it taught you?
I think that probably the greatest thing that I've learned about myself in the midst of this is my ability to stay focused on a key issue over a prolonged period of time. But to have an ongoing disaster that drags on for months and requires leadership and complete commitment to addressing that disaster in your community, that is a great personal challenge. And the other thing is that, the friendships that I have with colleagues around the country have become much more important than just personal friendships in the last 2 months. Suddenly, these are other mayors that I can talk with about what they're doing in their city, what they're seeing, what approaches they think are working, what we might do and how that might work or not work. And that's helped me serve the citizens so much better than if I didn't have these friendships in place.
And I assume some of those friendships came from the Aspen Institute, your experience there in the fellowship.
Oh, it absolutely did. I would say, I've thought a lot about my Rodell Fellowship throughout this. One, just that fundamental tension between personal liberty and collective safety, and what that tension is, and where the fine line in between those two is. But I've also thought a lot about, I remember our very first session in my Rodell Fellowship, Marty Gold talked about what leadership really is. And it's not just doing whatever you think is right and going down in flames. It is thinking about this, this band that exists, and how far you can stretch that band to lead people in the right direction without breaking it. And that's the art of leadership. I'm just very grateful that I had the chance to go through the Rodell Fellowship and visit with, by design, Republicans and Democrats. And it's a great reminder that there is so much more that we hold in common across party lines than what divides us. We have a tendency to focus so much on the things that divide us. But when you have a crisis, you need to unite and bring people together around those things that you can generally agree on. And I feel like by and large, you've seen that in communities and states all around our country through this event. There have been leaders at a local level who have found ways to rally their communities together to keep one another safe. And it's been extraordinary to see that broad scale collective humanitarian effort, which is one of the great humanitarian efforts, I think, probably in human history that we've just experienced over the last 2 months. And it wasn't one broad sweeping order from the national government. It was state by state, city by city, collectively doing what was necessary to keep people safe.
Mayor, please be safe. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.